So thank you all for being here, and thank you for hosting this conference. Congratulations on winning the NACSA award in order to sort of fund this event and make it possible. I think my role here is both to be sort of an ambassador of NACSA and to give you a little bit of our perspective coming into this conference, hopefully to set some context for what the outcomes might be. But also maybe to provide a little bit of wearing probably my other hat, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, some additional context for why we're even talking about this in the first place, other than it's sort of a necessity born out of the fact that these damn charter schools keep sending us charter applications. So let me talk about my other hat. So I'm deeply conflicted standing here in front of you today. I have like special interests all over the place. I'm obviously, as Susie said, I'm the chair of the NACSA board and have been involved in authorizing for about 15 years or so. And therefore, I sort of bring that perspective to bear. On the other hand, through my work at NewSchools Venture Fund, I am actively involved in supporting the development of charter school networks in various places around the country. I'm also on the board of directors of Achievement First and Uncommon Schools and Success Charter Network. So, even in the context of this authorizer, I have very serious conflicts of interest. So let's talk business. Let's see how we can get more charters for those organizations. That's the purpose. So now that you know, you can sort of apply all the salt you want to anything that I say from here on out. So I think the first question is, why are we even talking about this? Why does this matter? Why are charter networks of various kinds? I work mostly with organizations that we call charter management organizations, but there are other varieties of sort of organizational structures that produce charter school networks or charter expansions or replications or whatever it might be. Why are we even talking about this? Why does this matter? I think there are probably 4 or 5 reasons why this development in the charter sector is very important, very positive for the work that we all care about. The first thing is we don't have enough great schools, and that's sort of obvious. But what has historically been less obvious is how to get more great schools, not just in the charter sector but anywhere else, but certainly in the context of the charter sector. How do we get more great schools? Well, an obvious response is, well, let's look to the organizations that are already running great schools and see if they can do more. So just from a probability point of view, it might make sense for us to be looking there. The second reason is the greatest challenge from a, let's call it a production function point of view in schools is human capital. We don't have enough really great people. And the thing about sort of scaling what works in the charter sector is you can take school operators who are really talented educators and entrepreneurs, and you can get more out of them. I mean, when I think about, for example, Daisha Toll, as you all know, who's one of the co-CEOs of Achievement First, who's sitting there in New Haven running Amistad Academy, great school, serving a few hundred kids. The fact that we can take Daisha and Doug McCurry and use them essentially as the foundation for creating a network that's now educating thousands of students is an incredibly powerful tool for getting more great schools, more great teachers, more great opportunity in front of kids who need it the most. And unless you take advantage of that scarce human capital, you're never going to get there. The third thing is that in order to create the environment or the infrastructure within which you can get leverage out of those great people, in which you can replicate schools with success, you need to create sort of a critical mass of capacity and resources in order to actually make all of this feasible. I think people have in their heads, with good reason, that scale implies bureaucracy. And that is definitely a trap, and it's a risk, and it's something that charter organizations at any scale, but certainly a larger scale, are beginning to wrestle with. But the reason that that's a risk worth taking is because the other side of the coin is it creates the capacity for continuous improvement and excellence that may not always be present in the context of an individual school. The other thing that's related to it is it creates a capacity for sustainability of really great schools. So you can have one great school, and you'll all sort of, I'm sure, have seen this in your own work, and the leader goes away for whatever reason. And suddenly a new leader comes in, and the school becomes a very different place. And in the absence of having this kind of sustainable infrastructure within which that school exists, it's very easy to have a great school become a mediocre school in a short period of time. And finally, the reason that these sort of scalable charter organizations are important is that they create models for how to replicate success, how to build systems of schools, not just individual schools that serve children incredibly well. And they're not just models, but also partners in that work. Once they get to a certain scale, they can actually engage productively and meaningfully with school districts, state education agencies, and others in helping to drive broader systemic reform. So having these larger sort of fish in our little pond actually, I think, creates new opportunity for broader leverage for system change. So anyway, so that's sort of the quick argument for why this matters, other than it creates a bunch of headaches for authorizers, and we need to figure out how to deal with it. All right, so there's an opportunity, is I guess my main message here. So from NACSA's perspective, what are some of the sort of key priorities or challenges that we're hoping that you all are going to help us and help the authorizers around the country address? Well, most of this really applies to authorizing generally. It's really about how to apply these things in this particular context. So, you know, the first thing is rigorous decision making that leads to high quality schools. So it's sort of straightforward, but something unfortunately that exists, I would have to say, a bit more as the exception than the rule in the charter sector. Transparency. So that the process itself is clear to everyone on the outside and the inside as to how it works to ensure fairness and public accountability. And I'm sure all of you are very sensitive to this, but we are in the business of public education. We, you know, to the extent we are authorizers, we are actually holding, and charter schools for that matter, holding fairly directly a public responsibility, and we need to be serious about that. The third thing, obviously, is quality outcomes for students. It's easy to lose sight of that objective in all of the sort of process-oriented work that we're trying to do on a day-to-day basis. But in the end, it's about quality outcomes for students. And everything else is kind of is more than kind of, is a means to that end. And finally, and this is something that I think NACSA has come to more recently, and is still very, certainly very new in the authorizing world generally, is that authorizing needs to be about strategy. It needs to have a strategic purpose, not simply sort of a ministerial or administrative responsibility in response to individuals and organizations that submit charter applications. There is a role for authorizers to be reactive to what comes in. And it's a critical role, actually, because that's what keeps the door open to innovation and new talent. And that's what's so missing in pretty much every other aspect of public education. But by the same token, that's not the only responsibility for authorizers. Authorizers, especially as they get to a larger scale, as their portfolio grows, and Susie said that the SUNY CSI district is the 4th largest in the state of New York. If you don't have a strategy for how you're creating and managing that portfolio, you're not doing your job. So having a strategic purpose, and this is sort of a critical part of the work, and this is really where this question of how to deal with charter networks comes into play. Because deciding to support the scaling of a proven operator or a charter school, or the replication or scaling of a successful charter school, is a strategic choice. And one that's, again, I think you have to be thoughtful about, and but need to pursue proactively. All right, so that's sort of the context. Let me just lay out a few questions, many of which are already in the materials. But some questions that I personally, and I think NACSA generally, is very interested in hearing the response to. One is how to enable and encourage scale without undermining an open or transparent process for all charter applicants to come forward and be fairly reviewed. And without, at the same time, putting barriers in the way of investment in growing these charter networks. Because right now, the application process, the approval process itself, can be a hindrance to successful charter schools going to larger scale. So figuring out what's the right balance between encouraging it, enabling it, and at the same time ensuring fairness and transparency for all charter applicants. Second is how to support established proven providers while keeping the door open to new ones. So it's easy to be consumed by, okay, let's support the proven providers. It's also easy to say, look, we know what works, let's just scale it up and let's forget about the rest. As Pedro said in his remarks, innovation is a key part of what charter schools are. It's a key part of what any system change and improvement strategy is, and therefore the door needs to stay open, even as we are trying to do this other thing, scaling what works. How to evaluate the capacity and resources necessary to support scale with quality. So when you're looking at application, how do you know not just they can run a great school, but they can run 2 great schools, 5 great schools, 10 great schools? How to implement, and finally, I guess, how to implement a meaningful accountability system that doesn't put an entire network at risk due to pockets of failure, but at the same time is able to discern when pockets of failure are a reflection of systemic failure. And sort of the other side of this coin, how to ensure that we aren't creating institutions that are too big to fail, and that we're just essentially kind of propping up low-performing or mediocre networks of schools in the same way that unfortunately too many school districts themselves do. So that's my sort of piece for you. The one thing I just want to close with is that the reason NACSA has these leadership grants, the reason we're sort of here today and supporting this event is because our primary function is to strengthen authorizing and authorizers. And part of that work is to shine a light on and hold up really high-quality authorizers. SUNY CSI, if you ask anybody who does this work around the country, will tell you that if they are not the best and consistently the strongest charter authorizer in the country, they're in the top maybe 2 or 3. And I don't want to take sides in whatever that debate might be. But this organization, this institution, is on the leading edge of authorizing in the country. That's why NACSA provided this grant. Not just because we're really interested in the content and the substance of this conversation, but because we want to hold up as a model the work of this institution so that others can not only know where to look, but can start to emulate the work that you've already done, let alone the work that you will be doing in the future. So thank you all for doing this. Thank you for letting me be here.